Welcome to Fall Asleep 2. If you enjoy falling asleep to deep dives into history, philosophy, science, and all the wonders of the human experience, you're in the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see just how global this little community is. Now, let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and ease into the story. The story of the French Revolution doesn't begin with a guillotine or a storming of a prison. It begins with a kingdom that seemed on the surface unshakable. In the late 18th century, France was the most powerful and populous country in Europe. Its king, Louis XVI, ruled over a vast realm filled with grand chateaux, elaborate court rituals, and immense cultural prestige. Yet beneath this glittering facade lay cracks in the foundation, social tension, economic despair, and a growing hunger for something more. The France of the 1700s was a land of stark contrast. At the very top stood the monarch, believed by many to be divinely appointed. Beneath him sat the first estate, the clergy, and the second estate, the nobility. These two privileged classes, though a small minority of the population, enjoyed vast privileges. They paid few taxes, owned most of the land, and wielded significant influence in the halls of power. But the vast majority of French people, the so-called Third Estate, bore the weight of the entire system. This group included everyone from wealthy merchants and intellectuals to struggling artisans and starving peasants. It was a class as diverse as it was disadvantaged. While the nobility dined in opulence and the clergy collected tithes, the Third Estate paid nearly all of the taxes and had little say in how the kingdom was run. Economically, the country was teetering. Years of war, especially France's involvement in the American Revolution, had drained the royal coffers. The extravagant spending of the monarchy, symbolized by the lavish lifestyle at the Palace of Versailles, only deepened the financial crisis. Bread, the staple of the French diet, became more expensive than ever. Famine stalked the countryside. People grew restless. They grew angry. At the same time, a powerful force was sweeping through Europe. The Enlightenment. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu questioned the divine right of kings, championed individual liberties, and argued for the rights of man. These ideas, once the subject of elite intellectual salons, began to seep into broader society, carried by books, newspapers, and word of mouth. France, once a land of monarchs and mysticism, was waking up. The people were no longer content to suffer in silence. They were reading, talking, questioning. The words liberty, equality, and fraternity had not yet become a revolutionary slogan, but they were beginning to stir in the hearts of many. Louis XVI, an indecisive and often distracted monarch, tried to address the kingdom's mounting problems. He appointed finance ministers who proposed bold reforms, including taxing the privileged classes. But time and again, these efforts were blocked by nobles, by the clergy, by tradition itself. The Estates General, a rarely summoned assembly representing all three social classes, had not met since 1614. But by 1789, the financial crisis had grown so severe that the king was forced to call it once more. It was a fateful decision. Unbeknownst to Louis XVI, that meeting would become the spark that lit the revolutionary fire. The streets of Paris were already buzzing with tension. Pamphlets circulated, speeches were made, from the salons of philosophers to the back alleys of hungry neighborhoods. People were asking the same question. Why do we suffer while they thrive? France was about to answer that question in blood, in fire, and in revolution. The year was 1789. For many in France, the call to convene the Estates General was a moment of hope, a long-awaited chance to fix the nation's deep problems through dialogue, cooperation, and reform. But for others, it was a sign of how desperate the situation had become. The monarchy was crumbling under the weight of its own debts. The people were hungry. The air was thick with tension. The Estates General was an ancient institution, dating back to medieval times. It had not met for 175 years, and its resurrection was both dramatic and dangerous. It consisted of representatives from all three estates, the clergy, the nobility, and the third estate, the common people. But the system was far from fair. Each estate had one vote. That meant that the clergy and nobility, even though they made up only about 2% of the population, could easily outvote the third estate on any issue. The vast majority of the French population, 97% to be precise, was trapped in a single vote, perpetually overruled by the privileged few. As the Estates General opened at Versailles in May of 1789, delegates arrived from all corners of France. The Third Estate, more politically aware than ever before, came with lists of grievances, known as the Cahiers de Doléances. These documents spoke of injustice, taxation, food shortages, and the desperate need for change. Hopes were high. The atmosphere, though tense, was filled
cautious optimism. Among the delegates of the Third Estate were lawyers, writers, doctors, and merchants. Some of them would become legendary names: Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. They were not revolutionaries yet, but they were thinkers, men with sharp minds and sharper pens, and they came determined to make their voices heard. Early sessions of the Estates General were civil, even polite, but beneath the surface, frustration began to simmer. The Third Estate demanded that voting be by head, that is, one delegate, one vote, rather than by estate. This would give them real power, reflecting the actual makeup of the French people. But the king and the privileged classes refused. Negotiations stalled. Tempers flared. Days turned into weeks. Then, on June 17th, 1789, the Third Estate took a bold step. Declaring themselves the National Assembly, they claimed to be the true representatives of the French people. It was a quiet rebellion, a legal challenge, and a turning point. A few days later, they found themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall. The doors were barred, guards posted. Whether it was a deliberate act by the king or a logistical mishap is still debated, but the symbolism was clear. They were being silenced, refusing to be shut down. The delegates gathered instead in a nearby indoor tennis court. It was there, in the echoing halls of the Jeu de Paume, that they swore the now famous tennis court oath, with arms raised and eyes burning with conviction. They vowed not to disband until they had drafted a new constitution for France. This was not just protest, it was revolution. The king, rattled and unsure, was faced
with a choice. He could crush the assembly using the military force that surrounded Versailles, or he could yield. He hesitated. More and more members of the clergy and even some nobles began to join the National Assembly. The king's authority was slipping, not with a bang, but with a quiet, relentless slide. The old order was fracturing. Meanwhile, in Paris, the mood was growing darker. Bread prices were at a breaking point. Hungry crowds roamed the streets. Pamphlets and newspapers fanned the flames of discontent. Rumors spread that the king was planning to dissolve the assembly by force and had begun amassing troops around the capital. The people panicked. On July 11th, 1789, Louis XVI dismissed Jacques Necker, his popular finance minister who had supported the Third Estate. The news sent a shockwave through Paris. Necker was seen as a friend of the people, and his removal was interpreted as a declaration of war by the monarchy against reform. Then came July 14th, a date that would echo through history. The Bastille, an ancient prison fortress in the heart of Paris, loomed as a symbol of royal tyranny. Though it held only a handful of prisoners at the time, it was stocked with weapons and ammunition, and more importantly, with symbolism. Crowds gathered outside its gates. They demanded gunpowder and the release of its inmates. The guards resisted. Shots were fired. By the end of the day, the Bastille had fallen. Heads were paraded on pikes. The gates were torn down. The revolution had a defining image. News of the fall of the Bastille spread like wildfire. Across France, peasants rose up. They burned tax records, stormed manor houses, and declared an end to feudal obligations. Nobles fled. In such numbers, they would earn the name émigrés. It was called the Great Fear, and it was not coordinated nor planned. It was a spontaneous explosion of centuries of frustration, a cry of rage from the oppressed. The National Assembly, now impossible to ignore, began to draft reforms. On August 4th, 1789, they issued the Abolition of Feudalism. Titles were stripped, privileges dissolved. It was a radical leveling of French society. Just weeks later, on August 26th, the Assembly unveiled one of the most important documents in human history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. All men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It began. Liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. These were the new pillars of France. But the king remained. The monarchy still existed, and the revolution was far from over. The revolution had taken hold, but it had not yet reached its center. Paris was awake, the countryside ablaze with uprising, and the National Assembly was drafting bold new principles. But the monarchy still sat in Versailles, insulated from the storm. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, surrounded by courtiers, golden mirrors, and chandeliers, remained out of touch, hesitant and uncertain. They viewed the unrest as troubling, yes, but not yet fatal. In their gilded cage, they still believed that the structure of France could be preserved with modest reform. But the people had other plans, and those plans began to gather strength, not in the halls of government, but in the markets and bakeries of Paris, where the revolution would find one of its fiercest voices, the women. By the early autumn of 1789, the food crisis had reached critical mass. The price of bread, already unbearable for the poor, had climbed even higher due to shortages, hoarding, and economic disruption. Mothers could not feed their children. Whole families went days without proper meals. The hunger wasn't just physical, it was political. Bread, to the people of France, was not just food. It was survival, dignity, and justice. And when survival is threatened, history tells us, revolution follows. On the morning of October the 5th, 1789, a group of market women, fishmongers, vegetable sellers, washerwomen, began to gather at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. They were angry, determined, and drenched from the autumn rain. Their message was simple: bread and answers. Their numbers swelled rapidly, from dozens to hundreds, and then to thousands. Women, long considered peripheral in political life, were now leading one of the most important movements of the revolution. Armed with kitchen knives, muskets, and whatever tools they could find, they began their march. Not just a protest, but a journey of more than 12 miles from Paris to Versailles. As they marched, they sang, shouted, and chanted for bread and justice. Along the way, they were joined by sympathetic revolutionaries, soldiers from the National Guard, and even the occasional onlooker swept up the energy of the movement. The line stretched over miles, muddy, soaked, and resolute. When they reached Versailles, they didn't beg, they demanded. Inside the palace, fed this growing division. Figures like Robespierre began to rise in influence, calling for deeper transformation, greater equality, and a more direct challenge to the old order. In the countryside, the nobles who had not yet fled found themselves increasingly isolated and afraid. Their privileges had been stripped, their lands raided. Churches, too, faced mounting hostility as the revolutionaries began to question the immense power and wealth of the Catholic hierarchy. The National Assembly soon turned its attention to religious reform, passing the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790, a document that brought the Church under state control, requiring priests to swear allegiance to the new government. This move was both bold and dangerous. While it pleased many secular revolutionaries, it alienated a vast number of devout Catholics, especially in rural areas. The revolution was now beginning to devour its own support, igniting tensions that would later explode into civil war. Meanwhile, abroad, monarchies across Europe watched the developments in France with a mix of horror and fascination. If the French people could rise up and dethrone their king, what might stop others from doing the same? The revolution had become not just a national crisis, but a European one. Eyes turned to Paris, and whispers of intervention began to circulate in the royal courts of Austria, Prussia, and beyond. Back in the capital, life was rapidly transforming. Symbols of the monarchy were removed. Street names were changed. The royal fleur-de-lis gave way to the tricolour, blue, white, and red. And the language of revolution became the language of the people. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Not just slogans, but ideas that would reshape the world. But ideas, as powerful as they are, do not always bring peace. The revolution was entering a new phase, one in which ideals would clash with fear, power would shift like sand, and the promise of liberty would become entangled with the machinery of terror. The people had marched. The king had bent. But the revolution was not finished. It was only sharpening its blade. The king had been brought to Paris, but the question still lingered in every alley and every assembly hall. What place, if any, did monarchy have in a new France? At first, international support. To them, this wasn't just a political reform. It was an attack on their sacred identity, their birthright, their very existence. And so, one quiet night in June 1791, they fled. The plan was ambitious. Disguised as servants in a royal coach, the king and his family slipped out of the Tuileries Palace, bound for Montmédy, near the border with Austria. There, loyal troops awaited to escort them to safety. It could have worked. But Louis, unable to let go of his royal pride, insisted on traveling in a large, slow-moving carriage, rather than blending in with a swifter disguise. His face, immortalized on coins and portraits, was far too recognizable. At Varennes, a small town not far from their destination, the royal family was recognized and stopped. Word spread rapidly, and by morning they were surrounded by National Guardsmen and revolutionaries. Their escape had failed. They were prisoners once again. The return to Paris was a national humiliation. As the royal carriage re-entered the capital, crowds gathered not to cheer, but to glare in silence. The mood had changed. The king, once seen by many as misguided but necessary, was now viewed with open suspicion. How could a constitutional monarch be trusted if he had tried to abandon the constitution itself? The flight to Varennes, as it came to be known, marked a profound psychological break. For millions of French citizens, the illusion that Louis could be a partner in reform was shattered. He had run not from danger, but from the people. He had betrayed the revolution. And while the assembly officially declared that the king had been kidnapped to preserve the fiction of his legitimacy, few believed the lie. In the months that followed, the political atmosphere in Paris grew ever more charged. The Jacobin Club, once a small political society, expanded rapidly. It was a place where revolutionaries met to debate, organize, and sharpen their ideology. In its halls, more radical voices began to dominate. Voices that spoke not of reform, but of rebirth, of justice through fire. One of those voices belonged to Maximilien Robespierre. Thin, intense, and fiercely principled, Robespierre had begun as a quiet defender of Enlightenment ideals. But now he found himself increasingly convinced that the revolution required not compromise, but purity, and that enemies, both internal and external, had to be rooted out completely. The revolution, in his view, was not safe as long as the monarchy survived. At the same time, across the European continent, monarchies watched with growing concern. The French Revolution had begun to inspire uprisings elsewhere. Aristocrats fled France and pleaded for intervention. In August 1791, the rulers of Austria and Prussia issued
the Declaration of Pilnitz, declaring their intent to restore Louis to full power if necessary. It was a vague, symbolic threat, but it confirmed every fear the revolutionaries held. The old powers of Europe were aligning against the new France. This paranoia only fueled the radical movement further. The people felt surrounded, under siege from within and without. The revolutionary press fanned the flames, warning of aristocratic conspiracies, secret armies, and foreign plots. And while not every threat was real, the fear was. And in times of fear, moderation rarely survives. By 1792, the Legislative Assembly, pressured by radical elements, voted to declare war on Austria. The revolution was no longer just a domestic matter. It had become a
European conflict. The war, at first, went poorly. French forces were disorganized, poorly supplied, and demoralized. Defeats piled up. Rumors spread that French officers, many of them nobles, were sabotaging their own troops to restore the monarchy. As paranoia reached a boiling point, calls to abolish the monarchy entirely became louder. The people no longer wanted a constitutional king. They wanted a republic. And so, the revolution stood at the edge of a precipice. A failed escape, a foreign war, internal division, and rising extremism had all pushed France toward a choice. The moderate phase of the revolution, the phase of documents, compromises, and ceremonies, was dying. In its place, something darker was emerging. The days of speeches and declarations were giving way to the days of tribunals, executions, and blood in the streets. In the coming months, the king would face trial. The people would rise once again, this time not for bread or reform, but for vengeance and survival. The revolution had awoken, and now it would consume everything in its path, including those who had once believed they could control it. By the autumn of 1792, the tide had turned irrevocably against the monarchy. The tension that had simmered since the royal family's failed escape, the deepening war against Austria and Prussia, and the mounting radicalization within Paris had combined into a force that could no longer be checked. The revolution, once driven by Enlightenment dreams of reform, was now powered by rage, fear, and a fierce sense of betrayal. The question was no longer whether the monarchy could survive. It was when it would fall, and how. In the streets of Paris, the atmosphere was electric, volatile. Pamphlets painted the king as a traitor, a conspirator who had betrayed his people to foreign powers. Newspaper headlines screamed of royalist plots. Mobs gathered in public squares, more organized and angrier than ever before. The sans-culottes, radical working-class revolutionaries named for their rejection of aristocratic breeches, became a dominant force in the city. They demanded justice, equality, and above all, punishment. On August 10th, 1792, that demand came to a head. Thousands of citizens, many of them armed, stormed the Tuileries Palace. The royal family, now thoroughly despised, fled to the nearby Legislative Assembly for protection. But it was too late. The Swiss guards tasked with defending the palace were massacred. The monarchy, as a living institution, effectively collapsed that day. The people had taken back the power that had once been concentrated in royal hands, and they would not be giving it back. In the wake of the insurrection, the Legislative Assembly was dissolved and replaced by a new governing body, the National Convention. Unlike its predecessors, the convention was unflinchingly republican. There would be no more kings in France. On September 21st, 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished and the First French Republic was proclaimed. The old world had ended and a new one, untested, unstable, and brimming with revolutionary energy, had begun. But a republic founded in the shadow of fear cannot afford to be merciful. The revolution had entered a new phase, one that demanded retribution. And so, the focus of the convention quickly turned to Louis XVI. The king, now referred to only as Citizen Louis Capet, was placed on trial. The proceedings were complex, but their outcome was all but assured. The charges were damning: treason, conspiracy against the state, collusion with foreign powers. The evidence included his own correspondence, his attempted escape, and his hesitations during the early phases of the revolution. To some, the trial was necessary justice. To others, it was a grim spectacle, a test not of guilt, but of the revolution's resolve. Could a people truly be free if their former king still lived? Could equality be real if a man who had ruled by divine right escaped with his life? These were not legal questions. They were moral, symbolic, and soaked in the blood of years of suffering. On January 15, 1793, after long deliberation, the convention voted. The results were chilling. By a narrow margin, the assembly found Louis guilty and sentenced him to death. No exile, no imprisonment, death. A week later, on January 21st, The sentence was carried out. The scene was cold and solemn. A grey winter sky hung over the Place de la Révolution. Thousands gathered in silence, though some wept, others cheered. The guillotine stood ready, gleaming in the morning light. Louis was calm. He tried to speak to the crowd, declaring his innocence and calling on God as his witness. But his voice was drowned out by drums. The executioner swiftly bound him and placed him beneath the blade. At precisely 10:22 a.m., the blade fell. The king was dead. There was a moment of stunned stillness. And then cheers erupted from the crowd. Blood had answered power. The revolution had taken its boldest step yet. Regicide. But with the death of the king came a new set of problems. Foreign monarchies were horrified. The execution of Louis XVI sent shockwaves through Europe. Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic joined Austria and Prussia in their war against France. The revolutionary state, already unstable, was now under siege from all sides. Internally, the new republic faced fresh threats. The execution had not united the country. It had deepened its fractures. In the Vendée, a deeply religious region in western France, civil war erupted. Royalist sympathizers, peasants, and devout Catholics rose against the revolutionary government. The war in the Vendée would rage for years and claim tens of thousands of lives. In Paris, radicalism surged. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, gained dominance in the convention. The Girondins, more moderate revolutionaries, tried to slow the revolution's increasingly bloody pace. But it was too late. In June of 1793, the Jacobins purged the Girondins from the convention, arresting and executing many. The revolution was beginning to turn on itself. With enemies at the gates and traitors within, the new government created a powerful and terrifying institution, the Committee of Public Safety. At first, it sounded benign, a group to protect the Republic, but in time, it would become the engine of the reign of terror. France was now not just a nation in revolution. It was a nation at war, with monarchs, with rebels, and with its own soul. The king was gone. The crown shattered, but the thirst for justice, or vengeance, had only just begun. The French Revolution had been born in hunger, awakened by philosophy and sharpened by betrayal. But by the middle of 1793, it was no longer a revolution in the conventional sense. It had become a crucible, a roaring furnace that consumed enemies, friends, and ideals with equal fury. France was under siege from without and within, and in its desperation to survive, the revolution unleashed a terror the world would never forget. In the minds of the Jacobins, now the dominant force in government, the revolution had entered a state of emergency. The Republic, young and fragile, was surrounded by hostile monarchies and riddled with internal dissent. The war effort faltered, inflation surged, the Vendée was in full revolt, royalist conspiracies were rumoured in every village, foreign armies closed in. It was not a time for hesitation. It was a time for action, swift, uncompromising, and absolute. At the centre of this new phase stood Maximilien Robespierre. To some, he was the incorruptible, a man of unwavering virtue, untouched by personal ambition, devoted entirely to the ideals of the Republic. To others, he was a fanatic in disguise, a man whose pursuit of moral perfection gave way to political cruelty. Whatever he was, Robespierre was now among the most powerful men in France. As a leading voice on the Committee of Public Safety, he would shape the next year of the revolution with a severity that few could have foreseen. The guiding philosophy of this era was strange, even paradoxical: virtue through terror. Robespierre believed that terror was not a betrayal of revolutionary ideals, but their necessary defense. In his own words, terror is nothing other than prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. The revolution, in his mind, must root out enemies the way a surgeon removes disease. And if the body politic cried out in pain, so be it. The machinery of terror was precise, bureaucratic, and merciless. The guillotine became its symbol, fast, efficient, and impartial. It stood in public squares, not only as a method of execution, but as a warning. The Republic watches all. Laws were passed that gave the committee extraordinary powers. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, was perhaps the most sweeping. It allowed for the arrest of anyone suspected of being an enemy of liberty, a phrase so vague it could mean almost anything: noble birth, religious conviction, careless speech, or simple associations could lead to imprisonment, and imprisonment often led to death. The prisons of Paris overflowed. Trials, if held at all, were swift and one-sided. The accused were often condemned before they could speak. Entire families were swept up in the purges. The guillotine, once used sparingly, now worked constantly. Its blade fell on all classes: nobles, peasants, clergy, revolutionaries. No one was safe. Among the victims were many of the revolution's own early heroes. Georges Danton, once a close ally of Robespierre and a voice of the people, began to call for moderation. He urged the end of the executions, believing that the revolution had achieved its goals. For this, he was arrested and tried. On the scaffold, he faced death with defiance, reportedly shouting, "Show my head to the people. It's worth seeing." The revolution, it seemed, had begun to devour its own children. Camille Desmoulins, another early revolutionary and close friend to Danton, met the same fate. He had once rallied the people to storm the Bastille. Now he was condemned as a traitor. Perhaps the most shocking execution of all was that of Queen Marie Antoinette. Imprisoned since the fall of the monarchy, she had already lost her husband, her crown, and her children. On October 16th, 1183, she was brought to trial, accused of treason, incest, and other charges. Some absurd, others fabricated. Her journey to the scaffold was marked by silence. Gone were the jewels, the powdered wigs, the opulence of Versailles. She wore a simple white dress. Her hair had turned white. Her composure, however, remained intact. As she stepped onto the platform, she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot and quietly apologized. Moments later, the blade fell. But the terror was not limited to the famous. Every day, dozens of unnamed men and women were executed, often without a trial. The Place de la Révolution, once a symbol of hope, became soaked in blood. Families mourned in silence. The people, once jubilant, grew afraid. Conversations were hushed. Neighbors watched each other. The revolution had become its own kind of tyranny, one draped not in royal robes, but in tricolour sashes and slogans of liberty. Still, Robespierre pressed on. He introduced a new, quasi-religious cult, the cult of the Supreme Being. Traditional religions had been suppressed or banned, and Robespierre, ever the idealist, sought to replace them with a civic religion based on reason, virtue, and morality. In June 1794, he led a grand festival in Paris, celebrating this new faith. Dressed in ceremonial robes and standing atop a man-made mountain, Robespierre appeared not as a politician, but as a prophet. Many were disturbed. The man who had once called for equality now appeared to believe himself its judge. The terror reached its peak in the summer of 1794, during a period known as the Great Terror. Executions increased. Even those who had once supported Robespierre began to fear that they too might fall under suspicion. The revolution was spinning out of control, and its leader had become more isolated, more rigid, more extreme. By July, the tension was unbearable. In a dramatic session of the National Convention on 9 Thermidor Year 2, July 27, 1794, Robespierre was denounced. Delegates who feared for their own lives finally turned on the incorruptible. He was arrested, along with his closest allies. That night, after a failed suicide attempt and hours of chaos, Robespierre was brought before the same tribunal he had once commanded. The next day, the blade that had claimed so many lives fell one more time, this time on Maximilien Robespierre. The reign of terror was over, but the revolution was not. France had rid itself of a king, of nobles, of priests, and now of Robespierre. Yet the question remained, what kind of republic had emerged from all this blood? The death of Maximilien Robespierre did not end the revolution, but it did shatter the spell of terror that had gripped France for nearly a year. The reign of terror had extinguished many of its brightest minds and boldest voices. With Robespierre's fall, the blade of the guillotine finally slowed, and the people of France emerged from the long shadow of paranoia and silence, blinking into a future that was no less uncertain, but at last less bloodied. What followed Robespierre's execution was a period historians call the Thermidorian reaction, named for the revolutionary calendar month of Thermidor in which it occurred. It was not so much a new revolution as a recoil, a backlash, a collective exhale from a nation exhausted by extremism. In the days and weeks that followed, the remaining members of the National Convention moved quickly to dismantle the machinery of terror. The Committee of Public Safety, once the de facto government of France, saw its powers severely limited. The revolutionary tribunals that had sentenced thousands to death were rolled back. Political clubs, particularly the radical Jacobin Club, were closed or forcibly suppressed. Many of those who had once raised their voices in support of Robespierre now scrambled to distance themselves, denouncing his methods and ideology with sudden fervor. In the streets, the public mood began to shift. People who had once stayed indoors out of fear began to speak again, to gather, to breathe. The ever-watchful eyes of the state grew fewer. The guillotine, though not gone, was no longer the centerpiece of political life. Even the cult of the supreme being, Robespierre's attempt to spiritualize virtue, was abandoned. France, bloodied and fragmented, yearned for something it had not known in years: stability. But peace did not come easily. Though the terror had ended, the economic conditions that had fueled the revolution remained dire. Inflation soared. Bread was still scarce. Jobs were fewer. And while the revolution had removed the king, abolished feudalism, and rewritten society from the ground up, it had not yet found a way to govern effectively, not in a way that balanced freedom with order. In 1795, the National Convention produced a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 3. It was a carefully crafted reaction to the excesses of the past, and in its cautious structure, one could see the fingerprints of a generation traumatized by radicalism. Power was deliberately fragmented. The new government, known as the Directory, consisted of 5 directors who shared executive authority. A bicameral legislature was established to replace the single-chamber convention. The voting franchise was limited, excluding the poorest citizens, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man was revised to emphasize duties and responsibilities alongside freedoms. The Directory was, by design, moderate. It rejected the monarchy and the radicalism of the Jacobins alike. It sought a middle path, one of law, balance, and control. But France was not ready to settle. The wounds of the revolution were too fresh. The power vacuum left by the fall of the king, the execution of Robespierre, and the dismantling of the old regime left an unstable and combustible political landscape. Factions re-emerged. Royalists, emboldened by the end of the terror, began organizing in hopes of restoring the monarchy. Meanwhile, former Jacobins and left-wing radicals, now called the Montagnards, agitated for a return to the more egalitarian ideals of 1793. The Directory found itself in a constant state of crisis, caught between the fires of the radical left and the reactionary right. Uprisings flared, conspiracies blossomed. The streets of Paris once again became theaters of chaos. To suppress dissent, the government relied heavily on the military, and it was here, in this dependence on armed force, that a new figure began to rise. Napoleon Bonaparte, a young Corsican general who had shown brilliance in campaigns against Austria and in defense of the convention during the royalist uprising of 13 Vendémiaire, October 5, 1795, began to attract national attention. He was ambitious, strategic, and above all, effective. Where the politicians of the Directory argued and faltered, Napoleon advanced. The Directory Abroad, France continued its wars with various European coalitions. Victories in Italy and elsewhere, often led by Napoleon himself, brought plunder and prestige. But they also brought new enemies. The Republic was not merely defending itself. It was exporting the revolution through force, and monarchies across Europe saw this as a threat to their survival. Domestically, the Directory presided over a deeply unequal and unstable society. Corruption flourished. Confidence in the government eroded. Inflation and food shortages continued to afflict the poor. The ideals of liberty and equality, once chanted in the streets, now rang hollow for many. There was no return to the monarchy. Not yet. But there was no return to the passion of 1789 either. The revolution had aged, hardened, and dimmed. What remained was a government too moderate for the radicals, too revolutionary for the monarchists, and too divided to inspire unity. Still, the people endured. They had toppled a king, defied a continent, and reshaped the foundations of power. What they had not yet found, and what still eluded them, was peace. The revolution was not dead, but it was tired. And as the Directory lurched forward, its days too would begin to dwindle. In the wings, Napoleon waited. By the closing years of the 18th century, the Directory stood not as a symbol of strength, but as a fragile patchwork government trying to stitch together the remnants of a nation exhausted by revolution. It was a regime of constant crises, propped up by compromise, corrupted by bribery, and increasingly dependent on military power to assert its authority. For many in France, the promise of 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity, now felt like a fading echo, replaced by inflation, infighting, and instability. And yet, amidst this fog of confusion, one name began to pierce through, sharp, unmistakable, and full of possibility: Napoleon Bonaparte. To understand the fall of the Directory, one must understand the figure of Napoleon, whose story had begun in Corsica, but whose ambition knew no borders. Born to minor nobility and educated in mainland France, Napoleon rose quickly through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army during the early wars. He distinguished himself in the Siege of Toulon, and later, with cold precision, in suppressing a royalist uprising in Paris, firing cannons into the crowd, and earning the trust of the Republic's leaders. But it was the Italian campaign of 1796-97 that transformed him from a capable officer into a legend, sent by the Directory to lead the army of Italy, underfunded, undersupplied, and demoralized. forces with fiery speeches, strict discipline, and a genius for rapid, decisive tactics. In just over a year, he shattered multiple Austrian armies, brought vast territories under French control, and returned home as the brightest star in a darkening sky. Back in France, the Directory basked in his victories, but privately feared his popularity. Napoleon was no longer merely a general. He was a hero to the people, a symbol of order, energy, and potential rebirth. While the Directory floundered in indecision, Napoleon projected strength and purpose to keep him occupied and perhaps to prevent him from meddling in domestic politics. The Directory approved an ambitious and ill-conceived expedition, an invasion of Egypt. The goals were lofty. Strategically, it aimed to disrupt British trade routes. Culturally, it sought to bring the Enlightenment to the East. But militarily, it was a quagmire. While Napoleon's initial victory at the Battle of the Pyramids dazzled Europe, his fleet was soon destroyed by Admiral Nelson in the Battle of the Nile, leaving him stranded. Still, even in Egypt, Napoleon's legend grew. He portrayed himself not only as a conqueror, but as a scholar, commissioning scientific studies and archaeological excavations, including the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Even when he began to lose ground, the reports that filtered back to France told only of triumph. Then in 1799, sensing opportunity and aware of the Directory's increasing unpopularity, Napoleon slipped back into France. The political scene he returned to was even more chaotic than before. The war continued to drag on. The economy struggled. The Directory had become a government in name more than function. Factions within the legislature plotted constantly. People no longer looked to their representatives for leadership. They looked to generals. Napoleon, ever the strategist, saw his moment. With the help of key allies, including Emmanuel Sieyès, one of the original thinkers behind the early revolution, Napoleon launched a bloodless coup on 18th Brumaire, year 8th, November 9th, 1799. The plan was audacious. He would use his reputation and military backing to pressure the legislature into dissolving the Directory and creating a new government, the Consulate. At first, the coup teetered on the brink of failure. Legislators shouted, accused, and resisted. Napoleon, unused to such political theatre, floundered. He was even physically attacked. But within hours, the balance shifted. Soldiers loyal to him cleared the chamber, and the Directory was no more. What replaced it was something entirely new. Under the new constitution of year 8, power would reside with 3 consuls. a triumvirate, supposedly equal. But in truth, the first consul would hold supreme authority, and that position, of course, was filled by Napoleon. France had undergone yet another transformation. From monarchy to republic, from republic to terror, from terror to compromise, and now from compromise to autocracy cloaked in republican form. The revolution, which had begun with a cry for freedom, now delivered power into the hands of one man. But the people, weary of chaos and desperate for stability, did not resist. If anything, they welcomed it. The streets of Paris, once lined with mobs and echoing with shouts of liberty, now watched in silence as the soldiers of Napoleon marched by. The tricolour still flew, the slogans of the revolution still adorned buildings and proclamations, but the power behind them had shifted. The consulate would bring reforms, order, infrastructure, a new legal code, but it would also prepare France for the next phase. A phase that would see crowns, conquests, and conflict on a scale even greater than before. The revolution, in many ways, had come full circle. It had killed the king only to elevate a new ruler in his place. But this ruler was different. He had not inherited his power. He had seized it. And now, with the might of the state behind him, Napoleon Bonaparte stood ready to carry the revolution's legacy, not just across France, but across all of Europe. When Napoleon Bonaparte assumed the role of first consul in 1789, France exhaled with cautious hope. The revolution had gone from euphoria to terror, from bloodshed to stagnation. Now, under the command of a young, charismatic general, the country yearned for something it had not known in a decade: stability. And, for a time, it seemed as though Napoleon would deliver just that. The consulate, in theory, was a republic. It retained the trappings of revolutionary government, a constitution, elected officials, assemblies. But in practice, the machinery of state revolved around Napoleon. He held the reins of military, diplomacy, justice, and policy. The other two consuls, Cambacérès and Lebrun, were respected but powerless. The revolution had stripped power from a king. Now it placed it in the hands of a single man, not by birthright, but by ambition. Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate control. His reforms were sweeping and calculated. First, he brought order to France's chaotic finances, establishing the Bank of France and stabilizing the currency. Then came legal reform, the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a civil code that enshrined property rights, the equality of men before the law, and the abolition of feudal privileges was one of his most enduring legacies. Though it limited some freedoms, especially for women, the code brought coherence to France's fragmented legal landscape. It would spread far beyond France's borders in the years to come. Napoleon also focused on education, establishing lycées, or secondary schools, to train the next generation of administrators and officers. He reorganized the bureaucracy, making appointments based on merit rather than noble birth. He signed the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope, re-establishing the Catholic Church in France, but under strict state control. Religion, like everything else, was to be useful, not dominant. For many, these moves were welcomed. France was exhausted. Civil war in the Vendée had died down. The streets of Paris were calm. Food was more available. The economy slowly improved. Napoleon, the man of action, had tamed the chaos of revolution. But even as he restored order, Napoleon chipped away at the freedoms the revolution had once held sacred. Censorship returned. Political opposition was suppressed. Newspapers were closed or brought under state control. Surveillance increased. Dissenters were exiled, imprisoned, or quietly eliminated. Yet the people, on the whole, remained loyal. They had lived through starvation, terror, and anarchy. Now they had stability, pride, and even prosperity. The cost, liberty, was a price many were willing to pay. Then came 1804. By now, Napoleon's power was absolute. He had staged plebiscites, public votes, that gave his rule a veneer of popular support. And he had defeated royalist plots, survived assassination attempts, and won victory after victory on the battlefield. The stage was set. On December 2nd, 1804, in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French. The symbolism was unmistakable. Rather than allowing Pope Pius VII to place the crown upon his head, Napoleon took it and crowned himself. The revolution had abolished kingship. Now, one man raised himself above all, not through lineage, but through conquest. To some, it was a betrayal of everything the revolution had stood for. To others, it was its logical conclusion, the embodiment of meritocracy, the rise of a commoner to the heights of global power. Napoleon was not a Bourbon king. He was a self-made emperor, shaped in the crucible of revolution. But with empire came war. Napoleon's ambitions extended far beyond France. He sought to export revolutionary ideals under his control across Europe. He crushed Austrian forces at Austerlitz, defeated Prussia at Jena, and forced treaties upon Russia and the Holy Roman Empire. His grand army marched through city after city, redrawing borders and toppling thrones. In these conquests, Napoleon spread the ideals of the revolution, but often through force. He abolished feudal privileges, instituted the Napoleonic Code, and introduced secular government. Yet he also installed family members as rulers, plundered wealth, and demanded loyalty. Back home, France basked in glory. The revolution had begun in struggle and uncertainty. Now it stood at the center of a vast and powerful empire. Monuments rose, arches were built, medals struck. The name Napoleon became synonymous with destiny. But shadows gathered. War with Britain dragged on. The continental system, a trade blockade meant to cripple the British economy, backfired and hurt France's own allies. The Peninsular War in Spain, meant to enforce French control, became a bloody and costly guerrilla conflict. And in Russia, a vast and frozen land, Napoleon would meet the beginning of his downfall. But that story lies just ahead. For now, France stood at the height of its power, but it stood not as a republic. The revolution's promises had been reshaped, repurposed, and repackaged into the glory of empire. Liberty had given way to order, equality bent to hierarchy. Fraternity became nationalism. The revolution had changed the world. Now it rested in the hands of an emperor. Empires, like revolutions, burn brightly, but they do not burn forever. As the 19th century began, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the apex of power. He ruled a vast empire that stretched across Europe, his armies seemingly invincible, his image emblazoned on coins and statues. But even the strongest structures crack when pushed too far. And the empire forged in the fires of the French Revolution would soon face its final reckoning. The beginning of Napoleon's decline came not on the battlefield, but in the halls of strategy. His continental system, meant to strangle Britain's economy by banning trade with Europe, backfired. It angered France's allies, hurt its own merchants, and pushed neutral countries toward rebellion. Resistance smouldered in Spain, where guerrilla warfare and British intervention turned what should have been a swift occupation into a long and bloody campaign. But it was in Russia that Napoleon's ambition would finally meet its match. In 1812, against the advice of many, Napoleon launched a massive invasion of Russia. A force of over 600,000 troops, the largest Europe had ever seen. He believed that a show of force would bring Tsar Alexander I to heel. But the Russians did not engage directly. They retreated deeper into the interior, burning their cities and farmlands behind them. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and smouldering. With winter descending and supplies dwindling, the French army began its retreat. A nightmare march through snow, hunger, and relentless Russian attacks. Fewer than 100,000 men made it back. It was a disaster, and the spell of Napoleon's invincibility was broken. Europe sensed its chance. The Sixth Coalition, a united front of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and others, rose against Napoleon. Over the next 2 years, they pushed back his forces, liberating territory and closing in on France. Napoleon fought with his usual brilliance, but his resources were depleted. His empire, built on momentum, had begun to unravel. In 1814, Paris fell, facing pressure from all sides. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. The French monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII, brother of the executed king. For a moment, it seemed the revolution had come full circle. The Bourbon dynasty, though changed, was back on the throne, but Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France. His arrival sparked what became known as the 100 Days. Crowds gathered. Soldiers once loyal to the monarchy rejoined him. The king fled. Napoleon marched into Paris, greeted as a returning hero. For one last time, the revolution's energy surged through France, this time in the form of its emperor. But the coalition powers responded swiftly. At the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon faced the combined forces of the British, led by the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussians, under General Blücher. It was a decisive defeat. Napoleon was captured and exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would live out his final years, dying in 1821. The monarchy was restored again, but France would never be the same. The question remains, what did the revolution truly accomplish? It had begun in 1789 with ideals that electrified the world: liberty, equality, fraternity. The people of France had risen against oppression, against injustice, against a centuries-old hierarchy. They had torn down the monarchy, abolished feudalism, rewritten the laws, and declared that power came not from divine right, but from the will of the people. And yet, the revolution also descended into chaos. It birthed the reign of terror, executed thousands, and ultimately gave rise to an emperor who crowned himself. France swung from extreme to extreme, from royal tyranny to revolutionary tyranny to imperial rule. The dream of a perfect republic remained just that, a dream. But revolutions are not judged only by their outcomes. They are judged by their echoes. The French Revolution transformed political thought forever. It showed that ordinary people could challenge entrenched power, that rights could be demanded, that rulers were not gods, but humans. It inspired revolutions in Latin America, Europe, and even parts of Asia. It reshaped the map. It redefined citizenship. It forced monarchies to reconsider their foundations. Even the Declaration of the Rights of Man, drafted in the earliest, most hopeful days, endured. Its principles found life again in later French republics, in the United Nations Charter, in constitutions across the world. The revolution was not one event. It was a tide, rising and falling. It was a conversation, loud and painful, about freedom and power. And though France would continue to wrestle with monarchy and republic through more revolutions in 1830, 1848 and beyond, the spirit awakened in 1789 would never fully die. Tonight, as we